50 years of federal abortion rights ended.
I'm furious. Letting these people make decisions over your own body, over a woman's body, is just appalling.
Rage.
I'm grateful to the Lord that Roe v. Wade's been overturned.
And joy after the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, paving the way for abortion bans in multiple states.
With Roe gone, let's be very clear. The health and life of women in this nation are now at risk.
The impact already sweeping across the country as clinics make changes and close their doors.
The people have won a victory. The right to life has been vindicated.
Republicans celebrate the culmination of years of activism and the political maneuvering that led to the conservative majority on the court.
American women today have less freedom than their mothers. Reproductive freedom is on the ballot in November.
Democrats condemn the decision and focus on the midterms. Next.
This is Washington Week. Corporate funding is provided by...
For 25 years, Consumer Cellular's goal has been to provide wireless service that helps people communicate and connect. We offer a variety of no-contract plans, and our U.S.-based customer service team can help find one that fits you. To learn more, visit consumercellular.tv.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewens for the Ewen Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Once again from Washington, moderator Yamiche Alcindor.
Good evening and welcome to this special edition of Washington Week. Today was a seminal moment in American history. The Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, ending the federal right to abortion and a precedent set nearly 50 years ago. The court's 5-4 ruling came after a dispute over the Mississippi law that bans abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. The decision means states can now ban the procedure. With trigger laws and constitutional amendments already in place, almost half of the states are likely to immediately ban abortion or heavily restrict it. Republicans celebrated the decision.
House Republicans are incredibly grateful for the pro-life movement's tireless efforts for decades, leading to this day.
What an historic day this is, and what a great victory for life.
President Biden and Democratic lawmakers called it a devastating blow to women.
It was 3 justices named by one president, Donald Trump, who were the core of today's decision to upend the scales of justice and eliminate a fundamental right for women in this country.
It's a slap in the face to women about using their own judgment to make their own decisions about their reproductive freedom.
The decision will impact women of color and low-income women the most. In states with bans, women will have to drive hours and hours to other states to access abortion. Joining me tonight to discuss this on this historic day, Nia-Malika Henderson, senior political analyst for CNN, Zolan Kanno-Youngs, White House correspondent for the New York Times, and joining me here in studio, Leigh Ann Caldwell, Washington Post live anchor and the co-author of the Early 202 newsletter, and Josh Gerstein, senior legal affairs reporter for Politico. And of course, Josh, you broke this story. You were the reporter who got this leaked information that Roe was going to be overturned. I wonder, how does what we saw today, the decision that was made today by the court, how does it compare to what you saw and what your colleagues saw and what you reported on?
Well, you mean Justice Samuel Alito wrote the majority opinion, the draft that we published about 2 months ago, and it was almost identical to what we published. There were very few changes in the official decision released by the court. The main thing was Alito had to grapple with the arguments the dissent put forward and also the arguments that Chief Justice John Roberts put forward about why this was not the case to overturn Roe versus Wade. And so he made those sort of additions to the opinion. But by and large, he didn't really vary from the argument that he'd put forward in the draft that we obtained. And I do wonder if maybe he decided he wasn't going to be pressured into changing any of those words, so he decided not to.
And as part of this, there's this nuance here that I really want to get at. There's a 6-3 ruling upheld a Republican-backed Mississippi law that bans abortion at 15 weeks. But then the vote was 5-4 to overturn Roe v. Wade. Chief Justice John Roberts, of course, is the one who is changing his mind. Talk a little bit about the difference between those two rulings, and also what does it say about where Chief Justice Roberts finds himself in this court?
Right. So Roberts didn't want to go as far as his conservative colleagues wanted to go. He thought it wasn't necessary to overturn Roe versus Wade to uphold that Mississippi law. The Mississippi law would have essentially banned most abortions after 15 weeks, after a fetus had reached 15 weeks. And he said, look, we can just approve that law, but we can still say there's some federal constitutional right to abortion. And we don't have to decide right now, is it 15 weeks the line, or 9 weeks, or 6 weeks, or 4 weeks, or could a state completely prohibit abortion? It wasn't necessary to decide that to resolve this case, and so he wouldn't have gone that far, but that's now just a footnote in history because 5 justices did go that far and overturned Roe v. Wade.
And he couldn't persuade his colleagues, really, to go with him.
No, he couldn't. He made that argument that it wasn't necessary, but they said, look, we'll have to face in a year or two a ban on maybe abortion before 6 weeks in another state or in Mississippi. We might as well just square up to this question right now.
And Nia, as we noted, this decision has immediate impact. Clinics are saying that there are some women today who were in waiting rooms trying to get abortions who were turned away. Research shows that these are mainly Black women and women of color and low-income women who are accessing abortion and who will be impacted by this. I wonder if you could just talk about the impact of this on women.
Well, it's immediate and it's real, and there's not only the impact on women, there is an impact on men as well. I mean, remember, it takes 2 people to make a baby, and oftentimes you have men who are taking their girlfriends or partners to an abortion clinic so that their wife or girlfriend or partner can get an abortion. And the vast majority of women who make the decision to get an abortion do so because they cannot afford to have a baby. Many of these women also already have children, so they very well understand the high price of daycare, for instance. They understand that maybe they work in a job where they don't have paid family leave. So that, I think, is a broader question for some of these states. Will there be an expansion of the social safety net, for instance, if you in these states are compelling women to carry their babies to term? What does it mean for the fact that many of them are going to have to go to jobs where they don't have paid family leave? So I think that is going to be a real question. I think the other question is, will this have a mobilizing effect on women and men across the country, particularly younger men and women across the country who have come to know this right and in many ways have taken it for granted? The Democrats I spoke to think, yes, this will be a mobilizing effort around the issue of abortion. We obviously see protests all across the country tonight because of this decision, a decision people pretty much knew was coming because of Josh's great reporting and breaking this story, but also comes as a shock to so many people because we haven't lived in a country where the Supreme Court has actually taken away a right that people have taken advantage of for the last 50 years.
And Zolan, to Nia's point about the impact of this and whether or not it might mobilize people, President Biden was out today. He said this is not over as part of his speech reacting to this decision. There are now Democrats who have written letters to President Biden urging him to take executive action. What more do we know about the White House's strategy here and whether or not President Biden might take some executive action?
Well, one thing that we do know is that the president, his allies, those within the White House, when you talk to them, they do clearly see this as an issue that they hope will galvanize a base that has become increasingly frustrated with the administration on a number of other issues. You saw a quick rush today by the president, the vice president, the administration after this ruling came out. The vice president was in Illinois. She was set to give a speech on maternal health. She quickly casted that away and made that speech more so about Roe and the implications here. The president, in what I would say, especially most people, you talk to around the White House would say probably one of the more significant speeches historical speeches of thus far of his presidency. You could feel the gravity in the room there as he comes out, takes a deep breath. A dozen of his senior aides, all women, crowded to the right of the lectern as he begins speaking and says that this will have far-reaching implications on women's health throughout the country. He both tapped into the real-life implications for Americans, but also quickly turned to, if you really want a difference here, you're going to have to head to the polls. You're going to have to make a difference. He said Roe is on the ballot. And that is both an indication of the need of this administration and the party and the interest in trying to galvanize the base on this issue, but also the limitations that the president has when it comes to this decision. Most of the power is going to be with the Food and Drug Administration. You did already see them authorize certain abortion pills. The president did say that he'll direct HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, to ensure that access for that medication is still available for Americans. But once again, he called on Congress to take action, and they doesn't look like they have the votes right now. So it'll be another test as well of this administration and this president's ability to work with members of Congress to try and enact actual change at this time.
And Leigh Ann, Zolan wrote the introduction for you because, of course, we have to talk about Congress. There's this hearing now that's supposed to be happening in the Senate in July about the implications of this decision. What are you hearing from Democrats and Republicans about what happens now and what steps they want to take?
Well, let's start with the Democrats. The Democrats do not have the votes to do anything on this issue. They voted after your story, Josh, came out, knowing that this decision was going to be overturned. They tried to codify Roe v. Wade, and it failed. And they don't have enough Republicans to join with them. Now, there's a couple Republicans, Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski of Alaska, and they're working in a bipartisan fashion with Senator Tim Kaine on a compromise codification law. But they would still need 10 Republicans to support it. So there is no legislative path right now. And that is why Democrats are saying that this is now an election issue, and that is the only way that anything can be done. As far as Republicans are concerned, Republicans are pretty divided. There are some Republicans in Congress who are saying, if we take back the majority, we need to introduce federal bans on abortion so that abortion is illegal around the country. There are some Republicans who are a lot less comfortable with that. And when I tried to ask lots of them questions about that today, they try to skirt and say, let's just keep this at the states like Roe did. And so you could potentially see an internal discussion at the very least among Republicans about how they move forward.
And talking about the way forward and what might happen, nearly 1 in 4 women in the United States have an abortion by age 45. The majority of people who got an abortion in 2020 use medication to get an abortion. Josh, with those statistics, with that in mind, I wonder what you're hearing about what the court might do on medical abortion, on abortion pills. Legally, where might this go?
Well, I think, there's been a lot of concern expressed today about some of the things Justice Thomas said about that this could result in overturning the decision that guarantees a right to same-sex marriage or contraception. But I think the more immediate battles are going to be the kinds of things you're talking about, Yamiche, are going to be the questions of travel outside of states. If there are organizations that try to organize women to travel out of states like Texas and Louisiana into other states where abortion is more widely available, are those states going to try to crack down on those people? Are they going to indict people who are in New York and are using technology to, reach out to people in other states and arrange abortions for them or send them abortion medication? Will a warrant go out for those people's arrest? And then there's a lot of questions around technology and social media. We've had abortion banned in this country before, a half century ago, in many states, but there was no social media and technology at that time. Will we see states trying to geolocate people that are involved in these sorts of underground railroad efforts to get women out of states into other states where abortion is more available? Those are all the questions that the court is going to have to grapple with. Justice Kavanaugh indeed said that these issues around travel between states are going to come up, and he thinks women should be allowed to travel freely to get abortions in states where it's legal.
I mean, those are such poignant questions. You also mentioned same-sex marriage, and there are a lot of people looking specifically at Justice Clarence Thomas, who wrote in a concurring opinion the Supreme Court should reconsider the ruling that allowed for same-sex marriage for millions of Americans here. What are you hearing about whether or not same-sex marriage and other rights could be taken away?
Well, I mean, if you look at the rationale of this decision on abortion, you can see why people would raise that question, because they say, well, if there's no clear history of the right and it's not mentioned explicitly in the Constitution, then maybe it's in jeopardy. There's no mention of same-sex marriage in the Constitution. There's not even a mention of privacy in the Constitution, and certainly not contraception. So you can see how all those things would potentially be on the chopping block. Thomas was the only one to say explicitly that he'd like to move in that direction. It should be noted the other justices said they don't want to go. The other conservative justices said they don't see that as a logical fallout here, and this decision applies only to abortion. So I do think for now, those justices are unlikely to take Thomas up on his suggestion.
And Nia, though, even if it's maybe not likely right now, there are a lot of people who are scared about rights being taken away. I also think that we're now living in this country where blue states, and people living in blue states might feel a little protected by the Supreme Court. But I was reading about right here in Washington, D.C., things could change. There could be a federal ban because their city, I should say, is uniquely positioned to possibly have federal changes. But what are you hearing about the concerns about other rights and how that could be impacted?
Well, listen, I think there is a sense that obviously Clarence Thomas brought this up. Obviously, conservatives and Republicans more broadly didn't like that marriage rights were extended to same-sex couples. And I think he, in some ways, is saying, listen, this apparatus that led to this 6-3 Supreme Court that worked its way through different states and chipped away at abortion rights and finally got them overturned, that same apparatus could be used to overturn same-sex marriage, make it a sort of patchwork of states' rights across the country if you are an LGBTQ person. And so, at some point you might say, oh, you're being hysterical, oh, you're sort of hyperventilating about what could happen. But listen, we just saw what happened with Roe v. Wade, something that for many, many years people took for granted. Democrats took for granted. Democrats were sort of squeamish about wanting to be so pro-abortion and talk about the need for widespread abortion rights. And so now they find themselves in a position where they, I think, are going to argue, listen, Republicans not only have stripped away abortion rights across this country, they also want to take an additional step around curtailing other rights for same-sex marriage, for instance, for contraception. We already see this happening for voting rights as well. We'll see if it's an effective kind of ploy in a political campaign for Democrats going forward. But I think it isn't too much to argue that people who are looking at Clarence Thomas's words and seeing sort of it as a breadcrumb, a trail of breadcrumbs for Republicans and conservatives to follow along other rights and other, rights that have been granted over the past years. I think, it isn't sort of overreach to suggest that this is a court that could be ripe to curb rights that we've known for the last couple of years.
And Zolan, as Nia's talking about rights that could be curbed, I want to ask you about Merrick Garland, the Attorney General. He says that the Department of Justice is going to use all of the tools that it can to try to protect abortion rights. I wonder how you see that happening. What are the tools that they have to possibly impact the way that women access abortion in this country?
One initial sign that we have is the statement he put out today, right, where he made it clear that states should not restrict certain abortion pills. So that's one sign that we have. I also just want to say the point that Nia was just making about how the far-reaching sort of ramifications of this ruling and how it could apply to same-sex marriage, potentially interracial marriage as well, that actually mirrors the language as well of the White House, of President Biden and Vice President Harris. Over the past couple of weeks, ever since the Politico scoop on this, Josh's story, what you've seen is even if the president at times has, throughout his career, actually rarely sometimes uttered the word abortion, he did today. But what you have seen them really tap into to try and galvanize a far-reaching base is to frame this issue not just as one of abortion rights, but one of more so civil rights. And talking to some people close to the White House, that is to basically an acknowledgement both of the fact that, yes, there is a majority of Americans based off recent polls right now support Roe. But when you start looking at unlimited levels of abortion and limitless abortion as well, that's where you start to see some varied approval numbers, especially when you break it down to demographic groups. So it's just a fascinating point there as well. The framing of this White House too, framing this not just as something that has to do with abortion, but something that could lead to a broader infringement on civil rights.
And Leigh Ann, as Zolan's talking about sort of how to frame this discussion, there are poll after poll that show that Americans want to see abortion be legal in some form or fashion in this country. What's your sense of the sort of feeling that maybe there is a political conversation that will be successful for Democrats amid the midterms when people are, of course, dealing with inflation, gas prices, all of these different things?
Yeah, it's going to be a huge test. So we know for many, many, many elections, Democrats did not go to the polls over the issue of abortion. It was an esoteric fear that it was going to be taken away. It was not an issue that it was important to them. They had the access. Republicans, though, had a goal, and they did. And so now that the tables are turned, what's going to be interesting is if Democrats can mobilize on this. The DCCC held a closed-door briefing for House Democrats on Wednesday anticipating this, and they said that the polling is showing that voters are on their side, and the messaging is going to be Democrats have an answer, and that answer is Roe v. Wade. Republicans, their answer is complete abortion restrictions, extremists, you choose. And I will say there was a big gun story today too, when
I want to ask you about that, but really quickly, I want to ask you, because former President Trump put out a statement that said the following: this is following the Constitution. This brings everything back to the states where it has always belonged. God made this decision. I talked to so many people who supported President Trump, but they didn't like his tweets. They didn't like the brash style, but they wanted an abortion decision. What does that mean for Republicans when it comes to the next candidate?
Yeah, right. Okay, so as far as abortion is concerned, they have been running on this. This was Mitch McConnell putting in all these conservative justices so that they could get this decision. But now that they have this decision, there's some concern, more so in the Senate than in the House, about the suburban women voters. And that's part of the reasoning thinking behind Mitch McConnell and why he moved forward on a bipartisan gun bill is because he didn't want two issues to really peel off the suburbs. He can say, we are not totally unreasonable. We gave you this, even though they knowing the abortion ruling was coming.
And I want to talk about, of course, the gun decision that Leigh Ann is talking about, and the sort of issues of guns that happened this week. The Supreme Court issued the most significant ruling on the Second Amendment in more than a decade. The justices found that the Constitution provides a right to carry a gun outside of the home. So, Josh, how are they squaring these two things when it comes to abortion and guns? And what does it tell us sort of about how conservatives overall view rights in America?
Well, I mean, a lot of people do see a tension, right? Because they're saying that states, can't do certain things to ban guns outside the home or make it very difficult for people to carry guns outside the home. But in the area of abortion, they want to allow states to basically do anything they want in terms of regulation. So there is a contrast there. I think what the Republican justices would say is many of them consider themselves to be originalists. They want to look at the literal words of the Constitution. And there is a Second Amendment that talks about the right to keep and bear arms. People may disagree about what that means. There's no amendment that mentions abortion in the Constitution, and that's what the decision that came out today basically said. It's not in the Constitution. We don't think it's implied in the Constitution either. And so the issue was left to the states, whereas, this is something the founders put in the Constitution about guns, and that's something the court just has to grapple with.
And, if this decision wasn't happening, we might be talking about guns because there was that big that big movement in the Senate to pass bipartisan gun legislation. But I have to ask you one last question because we're focused on abortion tonight. Right. Josh, you broke this story. It is a career-defining story. Of course, there are so many people with different opinions on the actual decision, but I want to take us inside for a moment with the minute that we have left on what you thought when you realized what you had in terms of this document and what your reporting targets are now.
Well, we thought it was going to be a pretty momentous decision, and I thought when it first came out, our concern really wasn't that it wasn't authentic when we published it, but it's difficult to explain to people just why you're so confident that it's real. So when Chief Justice Roberts came out and said, this is an authentic draft, we thought that was a pretty huge a pretty huge, significant milestone. And
But
then,
did it take your breath away a little bit when you got this reporting and you thought, wow, what? This
oh
is
yeah,
yeah.
oh yeah, this hasn't. I mean, I've been covering the Supreme Court off and on for about 2 decades, and I'd never seen anything like this. And I started to research what kind of leaks we'd seen. And sometimes there are rumors about an opinion or rumors about a justice changing his mind in a case. But there'd never been an actual draft opinion that came out long in advance of the decision being released. So we knew it was a pretty extraordinary event, and that it was also on a Supreme Court decision that would get riveting attention for the public. As you know, Yamiche, of the cases that are resolved every year, the public doesn't pay attention to the vast majority of them. And I think as we see from tonight's program, people are very, very focused on this one.
Yeah, well, we'll have to keep watching your reporting. Thank you to Nia, Zolan, Leigh Ann, and Josh for joining us and for sharing your reporting. And on Saturday's PBS News Weekend, anchor Jeff Bennett has the latest on the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week is provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewens for the Ewen Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.